Hello and welcome to Future Self Dreaming. My name is Carlos Kukulkan. As I've mentioned in previous presentations, a major component of my own personal journey has involved learning about, understanding the principles of, applying and communing with sacred geometry. Since the early 2000s, I began studying sacred geometry and trained to become an ambassador of both the Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life and the Template workshops. So I want to begin to explore and explain some of the concepts related to sacred geometry and the progression of utilizing the knowledge and application of sacred geometry in awakening the multidimensional omnipresent self, otherwise known as our higher self or future self dreaming. In previous presentations, I began to explore the concept that consciousness has a chemical counterpart. And what is meant by this is that various chemicals affect our state of consciousness and allow us to access alternate perceptual states. Neurochemistry in the context of biology refers to the chemical processes that occur in the nervous system, such as the action of neurotransmitters within the brain. Our state of consciousness is dependent on the ratio of neurochemicals that are stabilized within the brain-body complex at any given time. So to put this very simply, if you're experiencing a state of depression, there will be a vastly different ratio of chemistry in your brain and body than when you're experiencing states of being happy, high, joyful, or blissed out. There are many factors that may determine this, such as nutrition, exposure to sunlight, ingestion, either consciously or unconsciously, of various chemicals or heavy metals, exposure to electromagnetic radiation, and other factors. These chemicals can be either endogenous or exogenous, meaning that they either have an internal or an external source of origin. In the context I'm speaking about in relation to the human body, the chemicals that affect our state of consciousness can either be produced within the body or they can be ingested from an external source. Humans have a long history of altering our state of consciousness by ingesting exogenous chemistry. In modern times, the pharmaceutical industry has profited greatly from synthesizing chemicals to be used in medications. However, indigenous, pagan and shamanic societies throughout the course of human history have ingested plants for the medicinal properties chemically produced within these organisms. With this concept of chemistry altering our consciousness in mind, this is the first presentation I will give in an ongoing series titled Sacred Geometry, Reverse Engineering the Psychedelic Landscape. It is my belief that because the source of consciousness is fundamentally geometric in nature, communion with sacred geometry can be a trigger for the endogenous production of chemistry within the body that activates altered states of consciousness that may be referred to as psychedelic, multidimensional, transpersonal, shamanic, or spiritual. Some of the first experiences that I had with sacred geometry that triggered altered states of consciousness came from looking at crop circles. Regardless of the debate about the origin and source of who or what is leaving the imprint in crop circles, the geometric ratios within their design have the capacity for triggering the awareness of interconnectivity within our brain. A good definition of consciousness can be defined as the ability to recognize patterns. In psychology and cognitive neuroscience, pattern recognition describes a cognitive process that matches information from a stimulus with information retrieved from memory. Recognizing patterns allows us to predict and expect what is coming. Pattern recognition allows us to remember. A word that I love, remember, bringing all the parts or the pieces back together. One of the things I love about sacred geometry is that it is the blueprint or the archetypal patterning to the structure of the universe. It shows us the template of all creation. Sacred geometry is literally information. Again, another word that I love, information. When you look at a piece of geometry like this one, it's informing you. Sacred geometry is the most fundamental form of information. With this understanding, we recognize that form is the shape of consciousness. So what is geometry informing you of? Many things. It is the information about who we truly are. It's informing you of the interconnectedness of all life. It's not necessarily information that the conscious mind grasps straight away. However, your unconscious mind recognizes the relationships when we look at sacred geometry. Ultimately, simply by interacting with sacred geometry, we can be taught directly by the inherent information that is exposed in its design. The concept of archetypes was popularized by the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, who explained archetypes as models of people, behavior, or personalities. He suggested that archetypes were inborn tendencies that play a role in influencing human behavior. Carl Jung also stated that synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see. As we commune with sacred geometry, we begin to remember the interconnectedness of all life and notice more and more unfolding synchronicity as a result. Looking at the etymology of the word archetype identifies the meaning as an original pattern from which copies are made, referring to the beginning or origin of the pattern. As we will explore in these unfolding presentations about sacred geometry and the nature of consciousness, the most fundamental pattern from which all other geometric information is born is that known as the flower of life, this image here. The flower of life is formed by the repeated interlocking of circles, which are two-dimensional representations of the sphere being this here. So sacred geometry is the archetype of all archetypes. It's the blueprint for the blueprint. It's the original pattern. And as we develop recognition of these patterns, we begin to remember the multidimensional aspects of ourselves. Being the primary archetype, sacred geometry therefore gives us a direct access to the transpersonal realm. The types of healing that come from an encounter with the transpersonal realm are those that invoke awe, where we may become overwhelmed with beauty, entwined with paradoxical imagery, encounter the divine masculine, feminine, and balance symmetry with asymmetry. Encounters with the transpersonal occur as a result of our consciousness expanding beyond the previous limitations or boundary conditions of our perceptual awareness. When we have a psychedelic experience that is brought on by chemicals such as LSD, psilocybin, and DMT, it's a very common experience for people to encounter the transpersonal realm and enter a landscape filled with toroidal, hyperdimensional fractal geometry. When having a psychedelic experience with plant medicines, the likes of DMT, a person is going to visually see these geometries. This may be referenced to as the language of light. Geometry is a form of language, which is the construct that makes up the fabric of reality. The term psychedelic is derived from Greek words that translate as psyche, soul or mind, and to manifest, hence soul manifesting. The implication being that psychedelics can access the soul and develop unused potentials of the human mind. So essentially, communion with sacred geometry is a way of bridging the soul blueprint or archetypal patterning of your being. Sacred geometry exposes the underlying relationships within all creation. Everything is relating with everything else in a holographic system of frequency, waveforms, and interference patterns. As mentioned, we can start to notice the relationships between each of these geometries, even if you haven't consciously studied them. By simply visually communing with them, your brain recognizes the relationships between one form and another, and this may result in the balancing of the right and left hemispheres of the brain. So let's look at these relationships by examining the entry point that most people start with on their journey with understanding sacred geometry by introducing the 5 Platonic solids. The 5 Platonic solids are formed out of the subdivision of the sphere. So the sphere being the most primary or monadic form. These 5 forms are known as the tetrahedron, this is it here, the hexahedron or cube, the octahedron, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron. So Platonic solids have several components to them, and there are only 5 shapes that I've just shown you that exist which have these components. The first of these necessitates the Platonic solid to fit perfectly within a sphere with each vertex touching the edge. The second rule is that they have to have only one shape, one face for each side. And for example, the cube has only square faces. It has 6 of them. And lastly, they must have the same angle between each side. For example, the cube has 90 degrees between each side. So the first of these Platonic solids is, again, the tetrahedron. It's the simplest form to come from the subdivision of a sphere. And to demonstrate, if I take one sphere, which can be thought of as a single cell in the body, which goes through a process of mitosis or cell division. Your body recognizes and responds to this because it's actually the unfolding pattern of growth that the body emerges from. So if we start with this one sphere or cell, and it goes through mitosis and forms 2 and then forms 4, each time it subdivides, if we take these 1 and divide it to 2 and then to 4, this is the shape that the 4 cells or spheres would look like. So the first of these Platonic solids, being the tetrahedron, comes when the sphere subdivides firstly from 1 to 2 to 4. And if we were to draw straight lines between the center of each of these spheres, we would form the tetrahedron, this shape here again. So the tetrahedron, as mentioned, it has the 3 components of a Platonic solid. It will fit perfectly within a sphere with each vertex touching the edge. It has only triangular faces, so 4 triangular faces, and has the same angle between each face, being 60 degrees in this case. So the word tetra means 4, while hedron denotes a specific number of plane faces. Thus, we have 4 triangular faces in this one. So each of the Platonic solids is also traditionally associated with a relationship to one of the 5 alchemical elements of water, earth, air, fire, and ether, and it's the tetrahedron that is traditionally associated with the alchemical element of fire. Now, if you can imagine, we had 4 cells, and the subdivision again goes from 4 to 8. When this happens, a lot more information comes out of this structure. For instance, we would then have 2 tetrahedrons, one that points up and one that points down, which forms a very familiar geometric structure known as the star tetrahedron. Now, the star tetrahedron is often referred to as the Merkabah, a concept that I outlined in a previous presentation. The full Merkabah is actually a series of ongoing fractal geometries of which the star tetrahedron is a central component. However, alone the star tetrahedron is not necessarily the Merkabah, as some would suggest. The star tetrahedron is also not one of the Platonic solids. However, if we look at this shape from another angle, we'll see a relationship that is formed. So we've got these 2 interlocking tetrahedrons that form the star tetrahedron. If I was to draw a straight line between each of the corner points, I would actually form the cube. So if I put them side by side, you'll probably be able to see that. So the cube, or the hexahedron, is another one of the Platonic solids. We can see, as mentioned, it would fit perfectly within a sphere. It has only square faces and the same angle between each face, which is 90 degrees. So the star tetrahedron and the cube, you can see the relationship that those 2 have. It's called the hexahedron because hex means 6, so the hexahedron or cube consists of 6 sides. We can also see in this star tetrahedron another relationship. If we look into the center of it, we can see the octahedron, which is this shape here. Now, octa means 8, so it has 8 triangular faces, fits perfectly within a sphere, and the same angle between each face, being 60 degrees in triangles. So the octahedron is the 3rd of the Platonic solids. And the cube, I forgot to mention, is traditionally associated with the element of earth, while the octahedron is traditionally associated with the element of air. The last 2 of the 5 Platonic solids are the Icosahedron and the dodecahedron. The Icosahedron is made of 20 triangular faces, and same angle between each face will fit perfectly within a sphere, so again, it is a Platonic solid. And the dodeca means 12 pentagonal or 5-sided faces, same angle between each face, fits perfectly within a sphere. The dodecahedron is the 5th, and the icosahedron is related to the element of water, where the dodecahedron with the element of ether. I'll just show you a piece that a famous sacred geometrist named Dan Winter calls the Star Mother. This is actually a nest of all the 5 Platonic solids. I don't know whether you'll be able to see it on the computer screen, but it has all 5 of those nested together in it. I mentioned, or I meant to mention, the concept of joules earlier. So to explain, a joule is formed by connecting the center point of each face of the Platonic solid. So if we start with the tetrahedron, if you imagine putting a dot in the center of each face of the tetrahedron, and if I was to draw straight lines between each of those, I'd actually form another tetrahedron in the center of that, pointing down smaller. This will give you a bit of an idea of that. So you can see a tetrahedron inside a larger one. And if we expanded that out to the same size as the larger one, again, we'd form the star tetrahedron that I showed earlier. So the tetrahedron is actually a joule of itself. So it forms the star tetrahedron. Now another relationship that we see, and again, the star tetrahedron, as I mentioned before, is a cube if we connect each corner, and it's got the octahedron within it. So the cube and the octahedron share a relationship as well. If I was to put a dot in the center face of each of the squares and connect those with straight lines, I'd form an octahedron inside the cube. And likewise, if I got a dot in the center of each triangular face of the octahedron, connected those with straight lines, I would form a cube inside of the octahedron. So the cube and the octahedron are joules of one another. And if we merge the two of them together at the same proportion, we'll form this shape here, which is the cube octahedron, a cube and an octahedron together. And then the other joule relationship, again, is between the icosahedron and the dodecahedron. Again, if I put a dot in the center face of each triangle, drew straight lines between it, I've formed the dodeca, and likewise, dots in the center face of each of the pentagonal faces, connected them, I've formed the icosa. So the icosa and the dodecahedron are joules of one another. And if we combine those together, we'll form that shape there, a dodeca icosa. So, just looking at my notes, hopefully beyond the intellectual understanding of how these geometric relationships are formed, you can have an encounter with the beauty and the feeling that is evoked when you witness the divine proportions and relationships that are held within each of these forms. In the next presentation, I'll continue on from this point to outline another branch of geometric forms known as the Archimedeans, and outline the progression of the expanding consciousness beyond previous boundary limitations that evolves as we commune with sacred geometry. If you like what you've heard here today and you want to continue with this journey more in future episodes of Future Self Dreaming, please hit the subscribe button, and you can follow Future Self Dreaming on Instagram and Facebook. For information on counselling sessions and workshops, you can visit the website futureselfdreaming.com. Thank you, in Lakesh.